Hello and welcome to the Kamala Show. We bring you interviews and conversations with technologists, entrepreneurs, filmmakers and other newsmakers from in and around the San Francisco Bay Area. My guest today is Dr. Vanden Bussche, who teaches at Stanford University. He recently completed his PhD thesis on a very interesting subject. What was the title of your PhD thesis, Eric?
Well, my PhD thesis was on the Sino-Burmese border dispute. I look at a 70-year-old dispute that unfolded from the late 19th century until 1960.
70-year-old border dispute.
Yeah, 70-year-old border dispute.
And that's how long it took to resolve this.
Exactly. And during this period, China went from being an empire to casting itself as a modern nation state. And Burma went from being a British colony to an independent nation.
And then into a military kind of authoritarian government.
Exactly.
Okay, so there were changes on both sides.
There were changes on both sides during this period.
But ultimately they did end up creating something that they both agreed on in terms of the border?
Oh yes, the Sino-Burmese border agreement that was signed in 1960 is seen as a success story. Up to this day, the Chinese government talks about how successful the negotiations were, and this is in contrast to the current border disputes that China is having with Japan, the Philippines, and other different spots, India, for example.
So we have a map of China, and that's the map of China there, and thanks to Google. If we had taped this 20 years ago, we would have had a globe.
Exactly.
But now thanks to Google. So China has apparently the most number of border boundaries with other nations, is that right?
I don't think there's, other than Russia, it has one of the most, it borders several different countries, and also something that's quite interesting is that China has, along its border regions, most of the inhabitants are ethnic groups. They are non-Han ethnic groups. So
and the bulk of China is Han?
The bulk of China is Han, yes.
Okay, so it has a double problem.
It has, yeah, it's a double issue. It's not just an issue of defining the territory, but also of ascribing national belonging to the ethnic groups. In other words, incorporating these ethnic groups into the Chinese nation.
So you said that, you know, during your research you uncovered some interesting new facts. What were these interesting new facts, and can they be applied when we think of China today and all the border problems that you described? It has, you know, Japan is one, Philippines is another, and Vietnam. And some of it also involves water, sea,
Exactly.
the ocean, the South China Sea. So what is it that you learned, and what can we extrapolate from that and apply to understand what is happening today? Well,
I accidentally found a series of maps in the National Palace Museum in Taiwan. They were recently declassified maps, but they were not yet cataloged. And these maps were dated from the late 19th century, early 20th century, which is a period when border demarcation in China started gaining momentum. And the reason border demarcation became a concern of the imperial court in Beijing was that the British, the French, the Russians, Western nations, they were advancing their colonial empires in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, and this created, this concerned the imperial court in Beijing, and they realized that one of the ways that they could curb Western imperialism and Western encroachment along their borders would be to define them, to negotiate border treaties with France in Vietnam, the British in Burma, the Russians in Central Asia.
So what is it that they did differently? Because I think one of the things you discovered is that China thinks differently about maps versus the Western notion of maps as well-defined boundaries, scientifically mentioned, And as you point out in your research, the 19th century was kind of the golden age of surveyors.
Exactly.
And in India, the British were busy surveying the land there and surveying the Himalayan range, you know.
Exactly. What's interesting is that up until the late 19th century, the Chinese, they did not view maps as accurate representations of space. For them, maps were simply most Chinese maps, especially the ones of the border regions, were pictorial representations, pictorial maps that showed the administrative hierarchy of the region. So you would
not
have
the map that we saw, Google
No,
map.
not the map. They did not have longitude or latitude. Chinese prefectures were generally depicted as surrounded by a wall. Local chieftains, they were
so it's a pictorial map with icons.
With icons, exactly. There were no distances.
And no lines.
And no lines. For instance, the maps that depicted the Sino-Burmese border, they simply in certain parts of the map, you would see writing, well, this is the border with Burma, but there would be no line, just 3 characters mentioning that. And the reason for that is the Chinese believed that only written sources, only texts, imperial gazetteers, contained accurate information on the geography.
So what you're saying is that they describe borders in text form.
Exactly. They describe...
Not in pictures like we understand it.
Yeah, mainly Chinese geographical knowledge was conveyed through written text rather than a map. And that's the big difference.
So you have something here.
So what I brought is very interesting. This is the reproduction of one of the maps that I found in the National Palace Museum. This map has some text, but what's interesting is it was produced. It's from 1893, 1894, and it was made by the Chinese negotiator, the Chinese minister in London, who negotiated the Sino-Burmese border with the British. And this looks a lot like a British map. And you can see they have latitude and longitude. And my question was, well, why are they using a British map as a model to make a map in which they will use in the negotiations and advance Chinese territorial claims? And I don't think that this is an embrace of Western cartographic techniques, because...
Then what is it?
Well, the Chinese negotiator realized that in order to advance Chinese territorial claims, he needed to use a politically acceptable medium, which was a map, and also politically acceptable language. So what the Chinese negotiator did, he drew a map following the model of a British map that he had of the Sino-Burmese border. But at the same time, he included in this map spatial markers that were referred in Chinese imperial gazetteers.
So the text, the famous
exactly,
text.
the text. So basically, he was translating text onto the map.
So this was to bridge a cultural gap. That is because, you know, China was trying to be on the same page as the Western countries were, so that they could speak in the same language, same common language. And that's what they did, you're saying.
This was a means to make Chinese territorial claims more acceptable to the British.
Did it cause more confusion because of the way the Chinese did, you know, they merged their knowledge with the Western knowledge of looking at maps? And did that cause confusion for future negotiations?
It did cause intentional as well as unintentional misunderstandings.
So what were the intentional and unintentional?
Well, a lot of it, one thing that must also be pointed out in the case of the Sino-Burmese border dispute is that there were a lot of regions along the border that neither the Chinese nor the English nor the British surveying commissions could actually map, because these areas were controlled by local chieftains, such as the Wa chieftains, who were very well known for headhunting. And so the British and the Chinese, when they made their maps, they had to rely on second-hand geographical knowledge, either from locals or at times what the British did in order to make their territorial demands more acceptable to the Chinese. They drew on Chinese imperial gazetteers, unwritten texts as well. So you see that there's an effort on both sides, both the Chinese side and the British side, to use different kinds of mediums and political language in order to advance these claims.
So, what part of these current disputes have a historical past? For example, you know, China and Japan, have they historically had problems? India and China historically have never had problems prior to 1947. You know, they've never fought a war.
Well, that's
so my question is, do any of these current disputes have a historical past?
Well, a lot of them do, and let me give you the example of a high-profile one that's been going on for months now, which is the dispute between the Philippines and China. During the summer, the Chinese, the Hunan map press, unveiled a new official map of China that included the disputed maritime territories between China and the Philippines, and included these territories as part of China. And the Philippines, on the other hand, what they're doing is they claim to have found a map, an old imperial map of China that was produced, I think, from the Song dynasty. That's around the 12th century, 11th, 12th century, in which the limits of China end in the southern island of Hainan, and do not include the disputed areas, the disputed maritime regions. China, on the other hand, is drawing on imperial texts, on old texts.
Dating from which century?
I don't know the century. I think dating from the Ming period, which is for 15th, 16th century.
So Chinese is newer, whereas the Philippine source is older. It's 12th century.
Yeah, but I think the point that should be driven across here is not so much which one is older and which one is newer. I mean, the Chinese, for instance, they claim that these maritime territories that are under dispute should be part of China, because Chinese fishermen and Chinese merchants were very active in that region during imperial times. So you see that there's an effort on both sides to draw on old texts, old maps, to advance their claims.
So your research actually is you looked at strategic mapping of the Burmese border, and your research reveals a backstory of how China thinks about its borders. Fast forward to today's world. What is it that the current president of China is doing differently?
Well, he actually is not doing anything different than what was done in the late 19th century, which is China is drawing on multiple sources of information, multiple different kinds of text maps, in order to be able to achieve, in order to be able to advance Chinese territorial claims. One thing that we should think of is, why are border disputes becoming, gaining the forefront in China's foreign relations.
Why?
And a lot of it has to do with the changes that occurred following the end of the Cold War. In the past, in the 2 decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the United States, they centered their attention they shifted their focus from Eastern Europe to East Asia, to the Asia-Pacific region. And the Chinese interpret this as a maneuver on the American part in trying to contain China's growing political and economic development. And so for them, one of the issues is defending borders. They believe that they should lay claim and advance their territorial claims over certain areas in order to be able to avoid, as a counter, as a reaction to this military, this refocusing of American attention from Europe to East Asia. Internally, domestically, China has also, there has also been changes. Socialism is no longer the dominant ideology in China, it's nationalism. And during the period
that you've lived in China for 10 years.
Exactly. I lived in China from 1997 to 2007 and then again from 2011 to 2013.
So you saw the rise of nationalism?
I saw the rise of nationalism. I saw the...
How is it being manifested?
In several ways. One of the ways in which it's being manifested are spontaneous street demonstrations, anti-Japanese. You've seen several anti-Japanese demonstrations in 2005. The last one was 2 years ago in 2012. And one of the issues that is being brought up during these demonstrations is one of the issues are China's territorial disputes with Japan and its country and its neighboring countries. And these disputes, these demonstrations are a grave cause of concern to the Chinese leadership. And let me just give you the example. In 2012, the last big anti-Japanese demonstrations, I noticed something different, which was a lot of demonstrators, most of them young people, were carrying portraits and posters of Mao Zedong, the Chinese leader who founded the socialist
China.
Yeah, who led the 1949 Communist Revolution and was China's leader until his death in 1976. And this actually was a veiled critique. These posts were a veiled critique at the current Chinese leadership, because Mao is always portrayed, especially in history books, as someone who fought against imperialism, someone who asserted China's footing in the international community. Exactly, who stood up for the Chinese at a time when the Chinese were just leaving the so-called century of humiliation,
right.
Because you had the Opium War from 1839 until 1842, and from 1842 until the 1940s is what the Chinese call the century of humiliation, in which imperialist nations carved up China and benefited economically, while the Chinese people were left in a very disadvantaged situation. So Mao Zedong is seen as the person who finally, quote unquote, liberated China from this situation, and that started putting China on the path of becoming a giant in international relations. So the young protesters in 2012 who were carrying posters of Mao Zedong, they were not nostalgic for the Cultural Revolution or for the 1950s and 60s. What they wanted, the point they wanted to get across was, we want the current regime to be as assertive of our rights on the international stage as Mao Zedong was. And this obviously concerns the Chinese government, and that's why you see a lot of this rhetoric that's being...
So that is what is informing the current president's rhetoric when it comes to border disputes.
Exactly. This rhetoric is aimed not just at the international community, saying, look, we're keeping an eye. We consider this to be our territory, and we're going to make sure that you don't take it away from us. But it's also for domestic consumption.
So why is it that we don't get to hear a lot about how China thinks about its borders, this textual interpretation and representation they have of boundaries that gives a very different outlook when the Chinese negotiate about borders? Why is it, folks outside of China don't know about this?
Well, I think, this is a more nuanced approach to looking at border disputes. We generally tend to think of border disputes as, okay, two nation states, they sit down, they map the territory, and they agree on a linear boundary, a line that goes through this territory. This did not happen in regards to China because, first of all, neither the Chinese nor the British were able to draw a line, surveyed the area. Both of them, and this is not just the case of the Sino-Burmese dispute, but also of other border disputes that mushroomed in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century. They were always looked at on a case-by-case basis. China never had a grand strategy to deal with border disputes because while China was while these border disputes were going on, it has
way too many neighbors.
It's not only that it has way too many neighbors, but also with European encroachment along its borders, the Chinese Empire had to recast itself. Chinese international worldview changed in the late 19th century, early 20th century. China also went through successive regimes. China negotiated boundaries, for instance, not with the Burmese or with the Indians,
but with the British.
But with the British.
And then you mentioned that many of those British maps are now in Taiwan. So when People's Republic of China was formed, they actually were working in a lacuna. They didn't have maps.
Well, they had very few maps. What happened was in 1949, when the nationalists lost the Civil War and Chiang Kai-shek then fled to Taiwan, obviously he saw himself as the representative, the legal government of China, and he took with him most of the documents, the maps,
the primary
and
evidence.
The treaties of concerning border disputes. The Chinese were left with very little, mainland China, and you also had this problem in mainland China, but you also had this problem in the newly independent countries that were neighboring China. For instance, Burma, all of their, most of their maps and documents regarding border disputes were taken by the British to London. And so, for instance, most of my research was done in Taiwan and in London, and it's funny.
So these countries were actually negotiating in the dark without the right pieces of information.
These countries, a lot of it, they were negotiating in the dark, and that's why it took China. The first border treaty that that the People's Republic of China signed with one of its neighbors was in 1960, 11 years after the communist revolution, and it was with Burma. And the Burmese, when they were negotiating with the Chinese in the late 1950s, they sent several dispatches or requests to the British government for their maps, and for certain documents concerning the border dispute, because they also didn't have much to go on. And and for China, another big issue was, well, there are all these different ethnic, non-Han ethnic groups inhabiting the border regions. So how do we incorporate them into the Chinese nation? Because at that time, for instance, when Zhou Enlai in the mid-1950s, he visits the Sino-Burmese border region, he is surprised at how the local inhabitants there, they move freely from Burma to China.
Very fluid border.
they don't have a sense of what a national border is. Local ethnic identity trumped national identity. So he was very concerned about that. And
could that still be a problem today? The local ethnic identity, trumps the national identity in some of these border areas?
In the case of the Sino-Burmese border, I would say no.
Okay.
The biggest problem now along the Sino-Burmese border is it's a gateway for drugs and narcotics from the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia into China. This is the biggest problem that they're facing right now in the region. And there are also several, thousands of people who don't have a nationality in that region because they, during the 1950s and 60s, as China was defining its boundaries with Burma and other nations in Southeast Asia, they fled to Burma. Especially in the late 1950s, early 60s, because of the Great Famine in the region. And then they were, to a certain extent, they were stuck in Burma. They had children there, they had lives there, but the Burmese government never recognized them. And nor their children. And so now you have a situation where you have, according to a Chinese media report that I read in 2012, there are about 20,000 people along the Sino-Burmese border region that don't have a nationality, that are neither Chinese nor Burmese.
So my last question is, so every nation has its own culture, and through this conversation, you've shed some light on how China thinks, culturally on some issues. What can startups and business learn? How do we understand the Chinese paradigm when we go to do business there? Do you have any tips?
Well, the tip that I would give anyone is try to understand their culture, show interest in their culture, in their language, and this is especially this is true in every country, but especially in China. Don't lecture them. When I started learning Chinese and became fluent in Chinese, that opened so many more doors, because it's not just that the communication becomes easier, but it also shows them that you have an interest in their culture, in their country, and that you took the time to sit down and really, look, I want to learn a little bit more about you.
So what you're saying is bridge the gap and try and understand where they're coming from.
Exactly.
Xie.
That's
all I know in Chinese. Thank you, Eric, for stopping by and talking to us about how China thinks about its borders and shedding a little bit more light on how we can better understand China from its cultural perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching. If you missed any of our episodes, you can catch them on our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care.